Hello, hello, and welcome back to Into the Dungeonverse. This is Mr. Adam, your host and guide. This is episode 21 of our show. Thank you for being here today. I'm excited to see you. I know last week I said I wasn't going to be going live anymore. I'll be live this one more day with you here today. So if you want to interact in the comments live right now, this is the moment to do it. So I want to briefly hit on our schedule for the week. Last week I introduced our weekly schedule. We'll be sticking with this for at least a little bit. On Monday, we start the week with some story time. So I have a collection of Arthur C. Clarke stories. We'll be hopping in and taking a look at one of those. We start the week on Monday with story time. Tuesday through Thursday is probably what a lot of you come here for, is our interactive quest, where you actually get to follow along with our story and make decisions at home and roll some dice, flip some coins, and actually get some role-playing action going on. So that is Tuesday through Thursday, so the majority of the week. And then on Friday, we wrap up with some role-playing resources. And that's where I sit down with you and I make a role-playing resource in front of your very eyes, and then also make it available to you as a PDF for you to use at your own leisure. So this can be for a Dungeons & Dragons game, or it can be for a game you're making up. It can be for another role-playing game. It can be for even using the system that we use in our interactive quest. So that is totally free and available for you, original content created in front of you. And so you get an understanding of the process, but then you also have the thing to use. So this week we're going to continue on. We got our quest hook, and we're going to go a little bit further down that path, giving you another resource, another map to use for your party and for your group. You can run this for your family, you can run this for your friends, maybe you just run it for your siblings at home. So that'll be on Friday. So Monday story time, Tuesday through Thursday is our interactive quest, and then Friday we wrap up the week with our role-playing resources. So story time today, I mentioned, was going to feature a story from Arthur C. Clarke. I have this collection of books here, or a collection of short stories here. It's an old book. You can tell it's got some stains on it, right? This actually came from our old high school library. I say our, my wife and I went to the same high school. And sometimes when you spend a lot of time in the library and a book is damaged enough that they can't keep it in circulation, because you see how it has some water damage, they will get rid of them, they'll donate them, and if you spend a lot of time in the library, you usually get first pick. So we have a collection of Greek myths and science fiction stories that come from that. So the one we are going to be reading is actually the one that the collection of short stories is titled off of. Think you should be able to read it, The Wind from the Sun. So we're going to read an excerpt from The Wind from the Sun, and mostly because it is a short story, but it's 20 pages, which will be about, at my speed of narration, 40 minutes. I'm not going to post 40 minutes of me reading unless someone asks me to do that. Let me know. I'm more than happy to do it. But I think we'll start you off, and then you can finish the short story on your own if we piqued your interest. We'll be sharing a list of Arthur C. Clarke stories that you can check out. Check those out with your parents. Arthur C. Clarke is a very prolific, meaning that he's created a lot of stories, not all science fiction. Some people call it speculative fiction because it's got some fantasy elements to it, especially like the one that we're using today. But go through those with your parents and find one that's a good fit for you, because he has some stories that are great for kids, he has some stories that are great for adults, and some that can be enjoyed by both. But go through with your parents and find the one that matches you the best and your interests, because when someone's created a lot, there's a lot to go through. So I hope you have had plenty of time to get comfy, find everything that you need, maybe a snack as we read. I am going to go ahead and get started. After we read, we're going to hop over to my art program, and we're going to draw some art, some pictures that has been inspired by the story. I'll draw with you, and you can draw at home or just follow along. But without further ado, let us get started. The Wind from the Sun by Arthur C. Clarke. The enormous disk of sail strained at its rigging, already filled with the wind that blew between the worlds. In 3 minutes the race would begin, yet now John Merton felt more relaxed, more at peace, than at any time for the past year. Whatever happened when the Commodore gave the starting signal, whether Diana carried him to victory or defeat, he had achieved his ambition. After a lifetime spent designing ships for others, now he would sail his own. T-minus 2 minutes, said the cabin radio. Please confirm your readiness. One by one the other skippers answered. Merton recognized all the voices, some tense, some calm, for they were the voices of his friends and rivals. On the 4 inhabited worlds, there were scarcely 20 men who could sail a sun yacht, and they were all here, on the starting line or aboard the escort vessels orbiting 22,000 miles above the equator. Number 1, Gossamer, ready to go. Number 2, Santa Maria, all okay. Number 3, Sunbeam, okay. Number 4, Woomera, all systems go. Merton smiled at that last echo from the early primitive days of astronautics, but it had become part of the tradition of space, and there were times when a man needed to evoke the shades of those who had gone before him to the stars. Number 5, Lebedev, we're ready. Number 6, Arachne, okay. Now it was his turn. At the end of the line, strange to think that the words he was speaking in his tiny cabin were being heard by at least 5 billion people. Number 7, Diana, ready to start. 1 through 7 acknowledged, answered the impersonal voice from the judge's launch. Now, T-minus 1 minute. Merton scarcely heard it. For the last time, he was checking the tension in the rigging. The needles of all the dynamometers were steady. The immense sail was taut, its mere surface sparkling and glittering gloriously in the sun. To Merton, floating weightless at the periscope, it seemed to fill the sky. As well it might, for out there were 50 million square feet of sail, linked to his capsule by almost 100 miles of rigging. All the canvas of all the T-clippers that had once raced like clouds across the China seas, sewn into one gigantic sheet, could not match the single sail that Diana had spread beneath the sun. Yet it was little more substantial than a soap bubble. That 2 square miles of aluminized plastic was only a few millionths of an inch thick. T-minus 10 seconds, all recording cameras on. Something so huge, yet so frail, was hard for the mind to grasp, and it was harder still to realize that this fragile mirror could tow him free of Earth merely by the power of the sunlight it would trap. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, cut. 7 knife blades sliced through the 7 thin lines tethering the yachts to the motherships that had assembled and serviced them. Until this moment, all had been circling the earth together in a rigidly held formation. But now the yachts could begin to disperse, like dandelion seeds drifting before the breeze. And the winner would be the one that first drifted past the moon. Aboard Diana, nothing seemed to be happening, but Merton knew better. Though his body could feel no thrust, the instrument board told him that he was now accelerating at almost 1,000th of a gravity. For a rocket, that figure would have been ludicrous, but this was the first time any solar yacht had ever attained it. Diana's design was sound. The vast sail was living up to his calculations. At this rate, 2 circuits of the Earth would build up his speed to escape velocity, and then he could head out for the moon with the full force of the sun behind him. The full force of the sun. He smiled wryly, remembering all his attempts to explain solar sailing to those lecture audiences back on Earth. That had been the only way he could raise money in those early days. He might be chief designer of Cosmodyne Corporation, with a whole string of successful spaceships to his credit, but his firm had not been exactly enthusiastic about his hobby. "Hold your hands out to the sun," he'd said. "What do you feel? Heat, of course. But there's pressure as well, though you've never noticed it because it's so tiny. Over the area of your hands, it comes to only about 1/1,000,000th of an ounce. But out in space, even a pressure as small as that can be important, for it's acting all the time, hour after hour, day after day. Unlike rocket fuel, it's free and unlimited. If we want to, we can use it. We can build sails to catch the radiation blowing from the sun." At that point, he would pull out a few square yards of sail material and toss it toward the audience. The silvery film would coil and twist like smoke, then drift slowly to the ceiling in the hot air currents. "You can see how light it is," he'd continue. A square mile weighs only a ton and can collect 5 pounds of radiation pressure. So it will start moving, and we can let it tow us along if we attach rigging to it. Of course, its acceleration will be tiny, about a thousandth of a g. That doesn't seem much, but let's see what it means. It means that in the first second we'll move about a fifth of an inch. I suppose a healthy snail could do better than that. But after a minute, we've covered 60 feet, and we'll be doing just over a mile an hour. That's not bad for something driven by pure sunlight. After an hour, we're 40 miles from our starting point, and we'll be moving at 80 miles an hour. Please remember that in space, there's no friction. So once you start anything moving, it will keep going forever. You'll be surprised when I tell you that our thousandth of a G sailboat will be doing at the end of a day's run almost 2,000 miles an hour. If it starts from orbit, as it has to of course, it can reach escape velocity in a couple of days, and all without burning a single drop of fuel. Well, he'd convinced them, and in the end he'd even convinced Cosmodyne. Over the last 20 years, a new sport had come into being. It had been called the sport of billionaires, and that was true, but it was beginning to pay for itself in terms of publicity and TV coverage. The prestige of 4 continents and 2 worlds was riding on this race, and it had the biggest audience in history. Diana had made a good start. Time to take a look at the opposition. Moving very gently, though there were shock absorbers between the control capsule and the delicate rigging, he was determined to run no risks. Merton stationed himself at the periscope. There they were, looking like strange silver flowers planted in the dark fields of space. The nearest, South America's Santa Maria, was only 50 miles away. It bore a close resemblance to a boy's kite, but a kite more than a mile on a side. Farther away, the University of Astrograd's Lebedev looked like a Maltese cross. The sails that formed the 4 arms could apparently be tilted for steering purposes. In contrast, the Federation of Australasia's Woomera was a simple parachute 4 miles in circumference. General Spacecraft's Arachne, as its name suggested, looked like a spider web and had been built on the same principles, by robot shuttles spiraling out from a central point. Eurospace's corporation's Gossamer was an identical design on a slightly smaller scale, and the Republic of Mars' Sunbeam was a flat ring with a half-mile wide hole in the center, spinning slowly so that the centrifugal force gave it stiffness. That was an old idea, but no one had ever made it work, and Merton was fairly sure that the colonials would be in trouble when they started to turn. That would not be for another 6 hours. When the yachts had moved along the first quarter of their slow and stately 24-hour orbit, here at the beginning of the race, they were all heading directly away from the sun, running, as it were, before the solar wind. One had to make the most of this lap, before the boat swung around to the other side of Earth and then started to head back into the sun. Time, Merton told himself for the first check, while he had no navigational worries. With the periscope, he made a careful examination of the sail, concentrating on the points where the rigging was attached to it. The shroud lines, narrow bands of unsilvered plastic film, would have been completely invisible had they not been coated with the fluorescent paint. Now they were taut lines of colored light, dwindling away for hundreds of yards toward the gigantic sail. Each had its own electric windlass, not much bigger than a game fisherman's reel. The little windlasses were continually turning, playing lines in or out as the autopilot kept the sail trimmed at the correct angle to the sun. The play of sunlight on the great flexible mirror was beautiful to watch. The sail was undulating in slow, stately oscillations, sending multiple images of the sun marching across it until they faded away at its edges. Such leisurely vibrations were to be expected in this vast and flimsy structure. They were usually quite harmless, but Merton watched them carefully. Sometimes they could build up to the catastrophic undulations known as the wriggles. which could tear a sail to pieces. When he was satisfied that everything was ship-shape, he swept the periscope around the sky, rechecking the positions of his rivals. It was as he had hoped. The weeding out process had begun, as the less efficient boats fell astern, but the real test would come when they passed into the shadow of the earth. Then maneuverability would count as much as speed. It seemed a strange thing to do, what with the race having just started, but he thought it might be a good idea to get some sleep. The two-man crews on the other boats could take it in turns, but Merton had no one to relieve him. He must rely on his own physical resources, like that other solitary seaman, Joshua Slocum, and his tiny Spray. The American skipper had sailed Spray single-handed around the world. He could never have dreamed that, 2 centuries later, a man would be sailing single-handed from Earth to Moon, inspired at least partly by his example. Merton snapped the elastic bands of the cabin seat around his waist and legs, then placed the electrodes of the sleep inducer on his forehead. He set the timer for 3 hours and relaxed. Very gently, hypnotically, the electronic pulses throbbed in the frontal lobes of his brain. Colored spirals of light expanded beneath his closed eyelids, widening outward to infinity, then nothing. The brazen clamor of the alarm dragged him back from his dreamless sleep. He was instantly awake, his eyes scanning the instrument panel. Only 2 hours had passed, but above the accelerometer, a red light was flashing. Thrust was falling. Diana was losing power. Merton's first thought was that something had happened to the sail. Perhaps the anti-spin devices had failed, and the rigging had become twisted. Swiftly, he checked the meters that showed the tension of the shroud lines. Strange. On one side of the sail they were reading normally, but on the other, the pull was dropping slowly, even as he watched. In sudden understanding, Merton grabbed the periscope, switched to wide-angle vision, and started to scan the edge of the sail. Yes, there was the trouble, and it could have only one cause. A huge, sharp-edged shadow had begun to slide across the gleaming silver of the sail. Darkness was falling upon Diana, as if a cloud had passed between her and the sun, and in the dark, robbed of the rays that drove her, she would lose all thrust and drift helplessly through space. But of course there were no clouds here, more than 20,000 miles above the Earth. If there was a shadow, it must be made by man. Merton grinned as he swung the periscope toward the sun, switching in the filters that would allow him to look full into its blazing face without being blinded. Maneuver 4A, he muttered to himself. We'll see who can play best at that game. And we will end it there. That's actually only 6 pages into this story, but man, we're right at the exciting and interesting part. So this is The Wind from the Sun, a short story by Arthur C. Clarke, and man, what cool imagery and fascinating things he referenced in that story. So I see Ben is just popping in, and Miss Kaylee has thrown a lot of resources out for us, so you can read The Wind from the Sun. You can finish this yourself, or maybe have your parents read it to you, because there are some bigger words in there. But that's the great thing about reading these books, is it helps us expand our vocabulary. And then we also have other Arthur C. Clarke's available for you if you like that style and you want to read more. And then here is the thing that I think is super, super cool. We now have light sails. We have a craft that launched last June using this concept, a concept that was created in science fiction, a concept that was created by someone who thought, this idea kind of makes sense to me, and I think it would make a really cool story. And now here we are. It launched last year, so in 2019, science fiction became reality. And that's not the only case. That's actually happened over and over and over again. Things that have been created by fictional writers have been turned into reality. And that's why at newminds.tv, at New Minds, we use STEAM, because STEAM has art in there. Arts and humanities are so incredibly important to everything else, because you can learn all of the methods that are required to know anything about astrophysics, but you gain the wonder and the curiosity by looking up at the stars and wondering, what is there? What is the story that resonates with you? And that passion, that curiosity is what drives people to learn. So I think that's just super fascinating that science fiction or fiction itself can actually inform our real world. And I just want to give props to the people who took something fictional and made it reality. That is amazing. And it's so cool how you need every single type of person. You need the people to come up with the idea, and then you need the people who are going to spend endless nights figuring out how to make that real. Man, it is amazing what we can accomplish when we work together as a crew. So now I hope you all got some imagery from that story because I definitely saw some stuff. Man, when I first read about it and I saw solar sails in my head, I was like, oh wow, that'll be, really cool. And if you've ever seen Treasure Planet, I was imagining something kind of like Treasure Planet, but it turns out it's like totally different than that. The scale of those ships astounded me. But the one thing that kept popping out to me as a consistent description was like the sails all had their own unique look. So when I focus on mine today, I'm going to try to create some really cool looking sails that have an interesting element to it. So before I hop over into the drawing, I will check the comments and see if anyone has asked any questions or reached out, which I don't see anyone. That's totally fine. Remember, you can always comment after the fact, and I do go back and check videos when we get comments, and I will try to respond if I'm able. So the drawing program I'm using today is the same one I used for my role-playing resources last week. It's called Mischief. It may still be accessible, but I know they are no longer selling their product. So I have this one. You can find online resources like sketch.io. I have used that in the past. However, it's a little bit harder to draw on it for me. So since I am using this as a demonstration, I'm going to use my drawing program, but you can do your own, and you can also follow along by paper. But let's get sketching. Oh my. There we go. All right. I'm gonna make sure my pen is here, do a couple test sketches, try my line sensitivity. I do. Awesome. So now I'm going to undo those. I don't know if you had any ideas come to mind. He had some really vivid descriptions of the different kind of sails, but I saw some. I'm going to start with my ship in the center. It was really cool when he described one of them. I don't remember which one. It was actually what I had been envisioning, so I'm going to change mine now that he described it. It was the ship in the center with the circle that surrounded it. That was kind of what I had envisioned originally. I'm going to draw our little ship here in the center, and he kept describing a periscope, so I imagine that there's some part of this that doesn't really like stick with everything else, so I am gonna have a part, maybe a tube that you can travel to. So I'm gonna draw this first part right here, put some lines on it, put our little window here. That's the hole. And notice I'm making the ship part really small because he described the sails as being miles long. So the ship itself, the part where there's a human, is going to be relatively tiny compared to the rest of our drawing. And then I'm going to draw a tube here, kind of going upward. If you've ever drawn on a tablet before, it's kind of interesting because I'm drawing down here on my lap, but I have to look up here. So there's a little bit of a mental exercise you have to go through when you first start using these and when you start using them again, because you have to connect your brain to doing something that's generally very, like fine motor skill. You're not touching the thing that you're making. Normally, when you draw, where you're putting pressure is where the mark is made, but that's not the case here. So it definitely takes a little bit of time, but the really cool thing about our brain is it adapts very quickly. So I'm going to make kind of like a diamond at the top, kind of matching the similar thing, similar design down here. Okay, so there's the actual ship part. I'm going to tighten up that tube later on, and of course, it wouldn't be a sketch with Mr. Adam if I didn't make some random lines at some point. So I'll tighten up that tube as I go along, but next up is the sails. So I don't know what you're using as inspiration for your sails. I had some, hopefully you're using the story a little bit. I had some imagery pop into my head as he was describing it, of course, but I'm looking around my room, and I haven't shown you a picture of him yet or put him on here, but I have a fish in a tank over here. He's a betta fish. call him Yupitar, and he's got some super interesting and cool fins. So I think I'm actually going to do my solar lens, my solar sails based off of his fins just a little bit. So I'm going to start with these really long lines coming out, kind of like he described. There were those non-silvery parts that floated in the center, so I'm going to start with these long lines out here. Some of my tools. These long lines coming out, nice and as thin as I can get them while still having them show up. Okay, and then I'm going to have them curve in a little bit to create that element that almost look like fins, and it makes sense to me for them to look like fins. Not sure if the science tracks, but I'm definitely one of the more, I like to create ends of it. Let someone else tell me if that makes sense for it to replicate nature. But it's interesting that a lot of times our good ideas do come from replicating nature. Okay, so I've got these out here now. Okay, but there needs to be something in the back because my beta's got these two back, but he also has some on top and on bottom as well as in the back. So I'm going to create smaller sail but have it be a little more articulated. Maybe this is the one that is used for steering. This one creates a little bit more articulation, so I'm going to make it out here like this. Oh wow, that looks a lot like a fin now. Okay, I'm bringing this one in. They're kind of asymmetrical in size, so I could definitely go in and shrink it down a little bit. But we could argue that maybe this one on the right side, or I guess it would be this side for you, the one on the right side of the image is kind of coming forward a bit, maybe to cause a turn to the left. And there's our random lines. Okay, and then we're going to put some down low. They're going to hang like this. Oh, that line was a little off. There we go. Okay, and I'm going to have these all come together kind of centrally, whereas the others are a little staggered. These are all going to kind of coil together here. So I might even draw a little coil. Maybe those can be retracted if we're gaining too much speed. But interesting element of how do you slow down? He talked about in space there's no friction, so what are you going to do when you need to stop? We didn't get to that part of the story. Then I think there needs to be another spindle out here for it to really make sense. So we'll have a third line come out. Because it didn't look quite right to me with just having it. And that third line will be connected to up here. We'll have this one come out here. Okay, and so we got a start to it. I'm not entirely happy with my design. I feel like there could be some other elements added into it. So I'm going to take a moment. I'm going to hop back over to the Facebook stream. I'll see if anyone has any comments, maybe features that they want to see in our construction. And then I'm going to come back over and I'll do a second draft of this and see if there's anything cool we can add. All right, so I don't see any suggestions, so I'm going to go with what I've been doing. I'm going to make another layer. This art program has a function here called layers. what I can do is I can create a new layer. I can come back and I can actually lower the opacity, making my art a little bit thinner. So I basically can trace what I already created. I'll come back up to my old layer, and then I'm gonna create some polishing elements. So I like overall the outside wings, I like the back wings, the front fins, I guess sails, not wings. The front fins, I ended up not really liking that much. So I think we might change that design or just leave it out entirely. But let's see. We're gonna start here, again with the center of the ship. I'm gonna make my lines a little more solid. Steady will be determined by my hand. I'm gonna make my lines a little more solid here because I'm considering this to be a final draft. Okay, and then we've got that tube. Oh, I hope that their tube is not that curvy. That would be unfortunate. Here's your spaceship. Why is it wobbly? Okay. Sorry, my pen is being a little glitchy. That's okay. What's a live stream without some technical difficulty? Not a live stream. I think I'm actually going to shorten it a little bit because I like the line ending right there. Okay, so I'll come in with my eraser and erase some of those lines. A few too many there. More than I intended. Okay. Oh no, I lost it completely. Oh, I moved it to the screen. I moved it to the screen behind me. That's what happened. I thought I lost it. Let me check and make sure that it's still streaming the right thing to you. Okay, you can still see it, but you didn't get to see it pop up on the screen behind me. Okay, back to our solar sail. Get back to our pen over here. And we're going to use this periscope as our base and as our reference to make sure that we make these a little more even this time. So we're going to have the other one come out here. Go to the same place. This one will come out there. And our third one is almost there at the end. Okay, and then that means that our side sails are going to twist a little bit, but that's okay. So we're going to make this one come out here. And I think that'll actually fix our front problem that I was looking at because I was feeling like the front was kind of empty. Pushing those side sails forward is actually going to fill that kind of front space that I was feeling was kind of empty. So it's very cool. That's why I like doing second drafts of things, whether it be stories or art, is while the first part is always great and you want to credit it to where it came from, sometimes you end up making something a little bit better the second time around. But it's based off of things that came before. Kind of like in the story, how his race was based off of that guy who was the Splash, who went around in the Splash, single man around the world, and thought that was pretty cool. And so he's now doing it from the Earth to the moon. You never know what your actions will inspire in others. That's why it's so important to be careful with what we do. Okay, so now I'm going to go back in and add that windshield once more. I'm going to put a little sheen across it. So we have the sun. come in here and we make the sails. So there's our sails in the back. Ooh, that left one, that left one doesn't quite look like the right one, does it? Let's give that one more shot. Oh, that was the wrong thing to do, because that just erased my guidelines. Let me go back. I think I need to make the top one curve just a little bit more. Alright, so finishing up our solar sail. For anyone just joining us, we are creating a solar sail vessel from a story that we just read an excerpt from. Alright, there we go. Now they match a little bit more. We'll come into our side sails here and finish those up. Ended up making it a little bit longer, but I like that look, so I'm keeping it. So here we go, we'll do the same thing again. Curve. And then this one's going to be a lot longer. Coming in there, it almost looks like butterfly wings. So a little bit different than what I originally intended. So I'll come back in here and I'll make my original layer invisible so we can see the final draft. Maybe not my final draft. I might come in and do a little bit more work. Sharpen it up a little bit because there's some places where of course my lines can be a little bit better. But when is a work ever truly completed? So here we are, the solar sail. Obviously we've come up with a better name for it. But there it is. So there's my sketch. Obviously there's lots of different ways you could do this. You could have your ship in the center like that one, and you could have the sail coming out around it. And its sail was just totally surrounding it. Maybe you have a vessel that is like he described being pulled. It could be just a large parachute, almost looking like a parachute in front, pulling your device that direction. There's lots of different ways that you could create this. And that's the really cool thing about that technology that he created in this story is there's lots of different ways it can be imagined. We can have something like what I did, or we can have something entirely different. We could have something that maybe just has these little spindly arms and there's circular sails out here. And it can articulate those arms to change where that pressure is. I think they might have described something like that. So yeah, totally make your sails however you want. There's mine. That's what I did, but you can make it totally different. All right, so there we are. We have read our story, The Wind from the Sun. We created a little art inspired by it. We can always go and we can create more. I might sketch in my personal handbook. I really like to draw by hand. I find the digital program to be really great for creating final products when I'm going in and I might want to make something look extra sharp. It's a lot easier for me to draw from a reference, but when I'm first creating my first draft, man, I love to do it on pencil. So I'm going to work on getting a way for me to show my pencil art to you, have that up while I'm working. But right now, it's just kind of holding it up to the camera, and that never really works. So that is it for our show today. Remember that Monday is start the week with story time, and then we move in Tuesday through Thursday into our interactive quest and wrap up with role playing resources on Friday. This will be our weekly schedule for a while, so we do have that in the comments if you want to have that available to yourself so you know what to expect. But thank you for tuning in to some real inspired learning. Remember to always pursue your passion until it becomes your talent, whatever that passion is. And maybe you'll be the one that's going to be sending someone into space in a different way because you did that. So up next is Round the World with Mr. Walter, followed by a lesson from on the steam train from Mr. Dorian, and then at the very end of the day, we wrap up after a New Minds lesson from the Vault. We wrap up with our CEO, Ben Cook, who I believe is a fan of these kinds of stories. Saw him tuned in, so I hope that he's finishing The Winds from the Sun right now or has already read it. But thank you for tuning in. We appreciate you being here. We will catch you tomorrow for the conclusion or the start of the conclusion of our story in Star Wars. That's where our interactive quest is right now. Last week we did some strange things and we ended up in a place where it's quite confusing. We see our potential new ally being friends with the person we just saw them fighting. So we are going to find out exactly what's happening tomorrow on our interactive quest. So we will see you then when we catch you on the next quest. Have a great day, and we'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Have a great day.